focus on helping them be a critical thinker. So I'm making sure that what I'm doing is appropriate and meaningful and relevant. Standards and benchmarks are important because they provide guidance. I think fun is super important, but to me it's a byproduct. I think good pedagogy is good pedagogy, whether it's face-to-face or online.
Relationships being the foundation of quality teaching.
There's so many things I do without thinking about it. And why? Why do I do that? And that's where it's important that you're doing that critical thinking, because you might see a cool video on there, but does it really nail what you're trying to get across? I'm so glad you called me out on that. Welcome, physical educators. This is Thinking PE.
Because Phi-Ed is more than just fun and games.
I'm Stacy Nelson.
And I'm Jamie Seneca.
And it's our goal to dig deeper beyond the activities that make your class awesome.
So buckle up and join us on this journey.
Welcome to another edition of Thinking PE. Jamie, we're always thinking something. You know what I'm thinking?
At this point, I don't even know. Help, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking it's actually not been all that comfortable teaching this first couple of weeks. It's very different than it's been in the past. And I've got almost 30 years under my belt, and it's uncomfortable being tossed into this new stuff. I was thinking, what would it be like to be a brand new, fresh out of the college teacher being tossed into this mess? But then I thought, what would it be like to try to train that teacher for this mess when you don't even know what you're training them for? Everything's changed, and now you're trying to prepare students, but prepare them for what?
Yeah, we're pretty fortunate. We had an opportunity to talk to Dr. Kristi Malley from Winona State University, and she's a college professor that's training these young professionals. And it does seem like, you're training them for a boating trip, and all of a sudden you take off in an airplane. And it's just completely, all of a sudden you find yourself in these super uncomfortable situations. Yeah.
And she kind of will lead off in this interview when she's talking about almost how she feels it's almost an ethical issue within herself of she doesn't know now what for sure to train these kids in on, how to prepare them, and she feels the weight of that, whereas none of us know. I mean, we know she's got to give herself a break, but she holds herself to a high standard. And it's interesting to hear her talk about that, how the inner turmoil that those professors are trying to figure out. They're trying to be ahead of the game so these kids don't get out and then be tossed to the wolves here.
Yeah, it all ties back to the basics. And that's what I found really fascinating, is that when we really dug into this and really went behind the philosophy of thinking PE and the why and the how, not just the what. And it was just interesting how it really came right back to the basic foundations, but then how and why those basic foundations are created. And I just thought that was a fascinating insight that she gave that resonates throughout this entire podcast. So let's meet Dr. Kristi Malley.
My name is Kristi Malley, and I currently teach in the Physical Education Teacher Preparation Program at Winona State University. This is my 6th year there, and I am an associate professor there. Prior to coming to Winona, I was really fortunate to spend 12 years at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, where I was, for quite a few of those years, the director of the program. Prior to that, I got my PhD at the University of Minnesota in developmental kinesiology. And that was a 4-year program for me. And I commuted from Osceola, Wisconsin. So I commuted an hour there and an hour home every day. Had a few kids at the time and still was able to coach volleyball back in Osceola, Wisconsin at the high school there. So that was awesome, because that's the job I left to go get my PhD. I was a 5th through 8th grade physical education teacher in Osceola. And I also taught 7th and 8th grade health. I was a high school volleyball coach, and I also coached the distance kids on the track team. Before we were there, I taught for 4 years in Phoenix, Arizona. That was my first teaching job. So it was kind of odd, because I was trained to teach PE in the Midwest in a gymnasium, and I go to Arizona, and I was at 2 elementary schools. I did not have a gymnasium. So I really had to shift the whole idea of building a culture when I'm outside with kindergartners, and 5th grade is having recess. So, just trying to really learn a new skill set. Let's see, I have a master's degree in human performance from UW-La Crosse, and I have my undergrad is from Wartburg College in Waverly, Iowa, and it's in physical education and biology education. So, and I played volleyball at Wartburg long time ago. I guess from a personal perspective, I have a husband. I've been married to him for 31 years, and he's a middle school student, I'd like to say, but he's a middle school teacher. He teaches 8th grade science, and he's been a cross-country coach for as long as I can remember. So he coaches high school cross-country. And I have 5 kids, ranging in age from 29 to 16. So 3 of them are still at home, and my oldest has 4 kids, so I'm also a grandma.
Wow.
So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah.
All that, and you still have lots of free time. That's pretty amazing.
Oh, yeah.
I always like it when teachers say they taught in Arizona or the Phoenix area. I like to see your sub plans for rain days, but you could probably write them on the back of your hand. Just you don't need them. So,
Yeah.
Well, we're going to answer some of the hardest questions you'll ever face in your whether it was in your teaching career, but in our gyms we like to do a warm up activity. So we got to warm up that brain matter. And we always started off with, so if you could share something you got in trouble for as a kid.
So I had to think hard about this one because I was a little bit.
I actually didn't have to think hard when I answered this question on myself. Not at all.
I pretty much was a rule follower all through school, just because I didn't want to get in trouble, because I didn't want to not get to play sports. But I do remember in 3rd grade, I like to talk, and I learned sign language, and so I would talk to my friends using sign language while the teacher was teaching, and I did get caught doing that once. So.
Wow.
So that was the thing I did.
And what did you do on the days that you got suspended for that?
That's right. Your job is preparing these young kids for heading into the education field, the physical education field specifically. And man, that's changed in the last 6 months. What's the changes? Just a couple of them, I guess. How do you even approach this now? What do you philosophically? What do you do different than a year ago?
Yeah, Stacy, I think that's the $1 million question. And I spent a lot of time this summer, speaking to colleagues across the country, and we had a lot of Zoom calls, national and international, and I don't think we ever really answered the question, because I think what I'm struggling with the most, and I'll be honest, this is a very big ethical struggle for me right now, is that I don't know the knowledge and skills my students need, because we don't know what their future is going to look like. And so, the skills I usually prepare them for, the pedagogical skills, I don't even know if those are skills that are going to be relevant to them when they have a job. And so I look at my students who are going to student teach in the spring with the very, very real likelihood that it could still be similar to what it's like now. And so the skills they need are way different than like what the skills my freshmen need, who aren't even thinking about student teaching. So, I can tell you how I've gone about it, but I don't think there is an answer, because we don't know. And that's the hardest thing. I've had to get really comfortable with being super uncomfortable with not knowing if what I'm doing is really beneficial or not. So
welcome to the world of education in 2020.
Yeah.
I think we're all sitting in exactly that same spot. I mean,
right.
It looks different for all of us, but that same sentence you just said is very, very true for all of us.
So, I guess as far as how I'm preparing them, I'm really trying to focus on helping them be a critical thinker. And so I really try to push them to move up that Bloom's taxonomy and into that depth of knowledge, and not just to be able to spit back and regurgitate and memorize what I'm teaching them, but to really think deeply about it. I'm trying to help them be a resourceful teacher. And so kind of leading them to as many resources as possible, and then creating tasks where they have to get into the resource and then teach one another about the resource. I'm really trying really hard to continually stress that it's about their students, that being a teacher is about service and it's about their students, and that all kids matter. And I always say all. I always follow up when I ever say the word all, I will say capital A, capital L, capital L. All students will matter. And so I still think a lot of the things that I used to prepare them for are still super relevant. You know, what are the characteristics of young children? You know, I teach mostly the elementary. I teach the fundamental movements class. I teach our motor development class. So I still think making sure our students really understand the learner, the K-12 learner, and what do they look like in every domain, and then what are the things we need to do as teachers, because that's what our students are going to be like.
That's fantastic.
And I guess trying to instill in them the fact that being a teacher means having a ton of power. You know, just a ton of power, and every single day they have the power to impact children's lives, to impact their colleagues' lives. And I try really hard to, as they move through our program, to get them to jump across that border of thinking of themselves as a student to thinking of themselves as a teacher. And that's a developmental process for my students. And I have to be super patient with them. You know, I draw a border on the ground and I model straddling it, and they're really at that stage where they're being pulled to still want to be a student, a college student, and then they're being pulled to starting to develop this sense of what it really means to be a teacher.
Yeah.
Well, I gotta tell you, I think having that solid foundation, and just like you said, solid foundations, focusing on the students, and then when you have that solid foundation, I think then if you teach them how to be resourceful and critical thinking, and now they can adapt and adjust to any situation that's thrown at them. And kind of like distance learning, if we know we have to make relationships with students, and now we just find those ways to find it to do that in a virtual setting. I think that's a lot of the challenges. As I say, you know, classroom culture, as I like to call it. Struggle with classroom culture in the past, you're going to struggle with it in distance learning too. If you were successful with classroom culture in the past, you're going to be resourceful, and you're going to find those ways to have success as well.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what you just said. You know, there's still those things that I'm definitely still focusing on, is helping students understand the standards and helping them really understand what it means to do backwards design, and to plan with the idea of what do we want our students to learn first, and then we plan the fun stuff, you know, the activity stuff. Go ahead.
I would say if you have that critical thinking when it comes to the standards, just be able to break down a skill, and now being resourceful, all those resources, whether it's Twitter, social media, you know, just the internet in general, to find out those fun and exciting ways to teach that.
Absolutely. I was going to say that I think a skill that young teachers really need that we don't always think about is the idea of self-care. And so I build self-care into each one of my classes. First, letting them analyze their own wellness behaviors, you know, their own well-being, and then slowly building in, sharing strategies with them that I use, and then giving them opportunities to share their own strategies, but just helping them recognize that if they aren't well, their students aren't going to be well. So,
you know, could you dig into that critical thinking, the resourcefulness? Give us like an example of what you do at that level, because that's what we're trying to build with our students when we're teaching second grade. But what does it look like? What's a sample assignment or project or type of discussion you have where you include either critical thinking, or you talked about resources as well? Anything come to mind?
Yeah, it does. So right now I'm in the middle of a module with my elementary methods class, and it's a 3-week module, and it's all focused on the elementary learner. And so I've created a series of lessons that are inviting them to watch a bunch of videos and read about kindergarten students, about first grade students, and to really develop this knowledge set about what are the universal characteristics of children, elementary children, in each domain. But then the assignment is about answering the question, so what? So what I'm asking them to do is to create a bundle of benchmarks, which if you've gone to any of the trainings around the benchmarks, you've maybe heard that idea of bundling benchmarks. So they are creating a bundle of benchmarks for K2 and for 3rd through 5th grade. And they're having to take that bundle, and if this is what I want students to learn, and this is what I know about students, then what does that mean in terms of how I go about planning, instructing, and assessing students? So I'm making sure that what I'm doing is appropriate and meaningful and relevant. And so it's not just about applying knowledge. It's really about analyzing characteristics of kids, applying that to what they know about the standards, and then creating, okay, so then what are the supports I'm going to do to help my students learn that? And they will struggle with it at first because they'll think pretty superficially at first. And so I gently push, I give a lot of feedback, I give a lot of ideas, and then I leave them alone.
Nice. So the standards, as I hear you talk, are still a central role. I mean, if we the original question I led with was, what are you doing to prepare the students? And you were like, we don't know. Well, you do know. You fell back to the basics.
Hey, Stacy, one part that really jumped out at me was her statement of comfortable being super uncomfortable. How do we even get there?
Seriously, it's such a great statement, and it writes really well in a book. It sounds so profound, but like you said, how do we get there? It's such a great thought of, how are we going to actually get comfortable? Because we're going to be uncomfortable, and to be able to get there. And like I said, it sounds so profound, but I'd like to dig into what is the nitty gritty of that. But what kind of the answer to that kind of brings me back to something you said in that segment where you talked about the foundation. If we can get these kids a foundation, or any of us a foundation, then from there we can springboard and do a lot of different things. We can adapt. If you have a foundation, you can change. You're going to feel much, much more comfortable. I think you've used a comment before about the military. What was that about brilliance and basic or something? What is that in the military? They call that.
That comes. It came. I mean, it does come from a military background, and we called it brilliance in the basics. We just had 3 foundational areas. It was fire, move, and communicate. And in those 3 areas, if you were brilliant, if you honed in on those 3 specific areas, and that gave you a solid foundation of skills to adapt and adjust. It didn't matter what your mission was, what country you were in, what type of terrain you were in. You were able to adapt and adjust those 3 basic skills and be very successful. And I really think that can apply to teaching. But help me out now. So I go from the Marine Corps, and now I dive into elementary Phi-Ed.
Yeah.
How do I take that same concept of brilliance in the basics, basic foundational skills, and being able to adjust to any situation?
So what are some of the first 2 or 3 that come to your mind when you're thinking of foundations of Phi-Ed teaching?
Well, I think Dr. Malley gave us the one of the first ones there was just being a critical thinker.
Yeah, because that's what she's really honing in on right now, is having her students really develop that skill. I would agree. Absolutely. What's another one?
I'm going to keep going on her list and say being resourceful.
You're just cheating. You're just using Kristi here. I'm trying to stump you, and you're just quoting her. Okay.
Yeah.
But you're right on. I can't disagree with that. Critical thinking, resourcefulness. Any others come to mind? Or are you going to keep quoting her?
I guess I would add communication to the list.
Ooh,
and just an ability to communicate with students.
Yeah. Verbally and non-verbally.
Oh, absolutely. I like where you went there, because I mean, body language is what's that core? Like body language is 75% of our communication.
Something like that. Yeah.
You can certainly Google that, but it's a ridiculous percentage of communication.
Yeah. And if people have built that up, I don't know that you can completely teach that at the college level. Some of that is going to have been developed as these kids grew up. Maybe they helped in Sunday school. Maybe they just, grew up and had younger brothers and sisters. Some of that, if they have some of that foundational stuff already in how to communicate those types of things, I think they're gonna be well ahead.
But so that gives us three basic ones. We got resourceful, critical thinking, and communication. I'd like to dive more into that critical thinking and what does it? We say, like you say, it sounds like a great book title.
Yeah.
Chapter 1, critical thinking.
Yeah.
What's going to be in chapter 1? What does it mean to be a critical thinker in the world of education?
No, I like where you're going. I'm thinking, for one thing, something foundational for a lot of kids that would fit under that critical thinking would probably be like being able to see a skill and break it down. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, I'm thinking as a coach or as a Phi Ed teacher, you see a kid struggling with their throwing, and there isn't a book totally written out. You've got your standards, but can you look at that kid and figure out either a drill you can do on the fly to help them, a verbal phrase that you can say something a little bit different than the way you taught it to help that student, just that being able to think on the fly and break it down to say, what does that student need to get that elbow in the right spot? That type of thing. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Well, I like where you're going, because it's the application of the standard, where we see that student that's struggling, but what is making them struggle? What exactly is it stepping with the wrong foot? Is it not having that elbow go forward when they're leading the throw? What exactly are they struggling with?
Yeah.
And like you said, honing in on that thing and then developing a game or an activity or some sort of drill to focus on that, to bring them to a meets level.
Yeah. And that all seems to fit under the category of critical thinking, where you've started your lesson, you did your teaching, you taught the whole class how to do it, and now you see a student that isn't getting it, or maybe you see 8 students that aren't getting it, and it's being able to critically think, maybe what I said isn't what they heard,
That's a wow.
And being able to
that is
step back. I don't know. Just assess yourself, assess what you said, assess what's going on, and think critically, and then adapt from there. That goes back to that resourcefulness and adapting on the fly to make a lesson good that was starting out in, I don't want to say the wrong direction, but that's just what teaching is. It's not science necessarily. It's much more of an art, where you're flowing with it and developing things with the students and in ebb and flow.
Yeah, you absolutely made a great point with that. What is that, metacognition?
Yeah.
That reflection piece, and I think that falls under the blanket of critical thinking. Whether it be lesson planning, whatever, so much is into that, under that umbrella of critical thinking. And I think reflectiveness is a huge one, where if one student is struggling, I can go help that individual student. If 8 students are struggling on the same thing, then I've got to look at myself. And I like what you said. Did they hear what I said?
Yeah.
Or did they hear what I said and they're doing exactly what I told them to do, which was wrong?
Oh man. So you said in the service they had 3 that they kind of focused on. You kind of nailed 3 here, right? Was it critical thinking you said was one?
Yeah.
What was the second one?
Critical thinking, resourceful, and communication.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to start. You could probably think further on this and add to it, but I think that those 3 would be a great place to start as a foundation.
And I agree. There's more you could add in there, whether it's developing a culture, classroom management, differentiation, personalized learning. There's so much more that can go in there. But again,
right.
I think if you've got that solid foundation of, in the military, fire, move, and communicate, you can apply that to an urban environment. You can apply that to a jungle, to a desert. Doesn't matter the terrain or the country that you're in. And I think it's the same as teaching. If you're resourceful, you're a critical thinker, and you've got good communication skills, it doesn't matter if they put you in a distance learning, in a hybrid, in a face-to-face model,
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
6 feet PE model, you're going to find ways to be successful. But
And go ahead.
I was going to say, but I also feel that there's something missing there.
Say more.
I think the fun part is often the most neglected piece of our teaching community. And we often look at it as a byproduct of what we do, but
And it is.
and absolutely it is, but I also think it needs to be made a point of what we do.
Yeah.
And I think that applies to every environment we're in, especially that distance learning environment.
Yeah. Yeah, because not just ability to make it fun for the kids, but the ability to have fun yourself.
It's actually almost, there's a piece of me that thinks it's almost taboo. Like, it's almost like if I sit in an interview and they ask me what's the most important thing and I say fun, they're like, oh, who's this joker? You know,
Yeah, is he taking this serious? Yeah.
And that's why I say,
You were supposed to say standards.
yeah, there's a lot of other things you're supposed to say, but at the end of the day, I think we forget how important it is that those students in that fun environment can be created in so many different ways. And I think there's a lot of things that are important in that, and whether it's building relationships, keeping the kids safe. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into, I mean, obviously you can't just willy-nilly have fun.
Right.
But I think that's a piece that deliberate and intentional fun.
Very interesting. So if we take those four: critical thinking, resourcefulness, communication, making sure we are having fun, the students are having fun, you are going to be more comfortable in any situation, even if it's super uncomfortable.
You know, and I got to tell you, all the state and national teachers of the year that we've interviewed on these podcasts,
yeah,
I'll bet if we go back to their very foundation of teaching skills that they're successful in, I'll bet they check every one of those boxes.
I bet you're exactly right. I mean, and we could check them for them from the conversations we've had. I mean, we haven't watched all of them teach, but I bet you're right on. Absolutely.
So in this next section, we're going to, you know, the critical thinking of being resourceful is a theme throughout this entire interview with Dr. Malley. And in this next section, we're going to talk about, she was on the standards committee, the state standards committee that rewrote the Minnesota state standards for physical education. And we're going to talk about that, but also more importantly, how that applies to the distance learning. What was the intention behind those standards, and now how do they fit in this new learning environment that we're in? Let's take a listen to it.
Now, you played a role in developing those, right?
Yep.
Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I was on the 30-person team, and then I had a role of kind of co-facilitating with Sutar, the writing of the elementary benchmarks. And then I was really lucky enough to be on the leadership team that then planned all of the professional development and all of the sessions that we did at MinShape. I learned a lot about Minnesota. And so that was the biggest reason why I wanted to be on the committee, is because that happened like right after I moved to WSU.
Sure.
And so
yeah.
I was really involved in the state of Wisconsin, and I didn't know anything about Minnesota. So I learned a lot about MDE, about physical education, I met a ton of people, you know, really awesome people with a lot of different perspectives. I think when you're on a committee of 30 people, you have to be really open-minded and be a good listener.
So after digging in and studying them and hammering with them and arguing about them and compromising, are you more sold on them that they are the foundation of good PE teaching, or are you kind of like, oh, we had to compromise? I don't know. I mean, where do you wrestle? Where do they land in the education process? They have a role, but are they found? You know, how would you describe that?
So again, looking through the elementary lens, I feel really good about the elementary benchmarks. I feel really good about the fact that they're developmental, that when you look across the row and you go from kindergarten to 5th grade, you can really see that we thought very deeply about the development of the child and how that is a progression. I feel really good about those things. I will be really honest with you. I struggle with this question a lot. And because I'm constantly asking myself, why? And, you know, what is our role in physical education? And I think it's about having a balance. I think the standards and benchmarks are important because they provide guidance. They provide some accountability system, which I think is important. They're a starting point, but we need to remember that their benchmarks are the minimal level of expectation that we want kids to achieve at the end of a grade level. They're not meant to be the be all end all. I love the benchmarks K-12 because you don't ever see a specific activity listed, because they're really open to teachers being able to make them their own. And so if I want to meet this benchmark using a jump rope, I can. But if I want to meet this benchmark using, using a basketball, using a yoga mat, using a mountain bike, using a canoe, using Tabata, I have the ability to not focus anymore so much on the physical activity. And it really makes people focus on what it is they want students to learn.
I love that. Boy, you nailed that, how you described that. Jamie and I kind of met around the standards when we were using the standards, and we're making rubrics. And it was so frustrating at the beginning because we thought we were being given these rigid rules to follow. And then it took us quite a long time, but we finally found out, I think, what do we call it, Jamie? The genius of the standards is their vagueness, that it puts the power in our hands. And it's when we finally realized that you guys designed it, like you just talked about there, so we would have the power, the guidance is there, but we can do it in any way we want to. As a matter of fact, it's kind of designed so you can hit it in the fall, touch on it in the winter, and hit it again in the spring. You're still hitting the same standard with 3 different maybe units you're doing. And there's just a genius in the depth of, once we realized you weren't trying to give us some rigid thing to follow, because that was hard to try to figure out what you guys were saying, until we just backed off and said, I get it. They think we're professionals. They want us just to read this and then figure out how to do it. And it's like, oh, I love it. Just took the weight off us in many, many ways. And then we were able to cruise
That's
in
awesome.
many ways through that. So
I'd like to add one thing there, is that, because you had said something that hit me, where, are the standards the be all, the focus. And I want to reiterate what I meant by keeping a balance, because we need to always remember that our first and foremost job is to help kids experience the joy of movement. And sometimes the standards and benchmarks can get in the way of that if we're so tunnel focused on, I have to do this, I have to check it off, I have to do this assessment. And I would encourage teachers to take a breath. And yeah, they're there. We should be using them. They are a wonderful guide. The state of Minnesota says that all children should have a quality physical education experience and demonstrate competency in those. But I don't want teachers to lose the fact that our job is to turn kids on to believing that they fit into a movement culture. That movement is joyful, that movement is delightful, that movement opens up doors that a lot of other things don't open up. And so I think if we forget that we're missing out on our important job. But we don't want to only do that. I think we do it all together in an integrated, connected way.
2 words you said there. One was, framework, and one was, earlier you mentioned minimum. So this is the minimum that the kids in Minnesota should get. And this is a framework to make sure where you don't have teachers going all over the place and teaching, crazy. But with those 2, within that minimum and framework, man, you're given a lot of freedom. And like you said, the responsibility to make sure these kids just have the most fun part of their day.
Take all this and now move it to the virtual setting, into the distance learning or the hybrid model that we face. And how does that change our approach to standards? Does that change our approach to the standards? And to kind of prep you a little bit, I think in the distance learning setting, we did a pretty good job, or at least I did a pretty good job and was comfortable with the knowledge and the fitness-based standards. Where we struggled or fell short was when we started getting to the manipulatives in the first standard there. So how does this all apply to distance learning?
Yeah, good question. I think we need to ask somebody that question who knows the answer.
Well, but I think is it the flexibility in the standard? Is the goal to create those lifelong movers and just utilizing those standards as a tool to help them explore movement with the manipulatives?
Yeah, I would say, if we stay virtually, if this becomes our new norm, that the state is going to have to take a look at all content areas, standards and benchmarks, all of them, because not only is there too many, because virtual takes twice as long to do anything virtually, but there are things that aren't the priority when it's virtual. And so I still think I'm a heavy believer in standard one. And, I have a lot of debates with people about that, but I still believe that if a student doesn't believe that they're competent, so doesn't have perceived competence, that they're not going to choose to be active and they're not going to reap the fun benefit. I think fun is super important, but to me, it's a byproduct. It's not the goal, it's the byproduct. And it's the byproduct of relationship building and meeting the kids where they're at and making things relevant and meaningful for the students. So, right now I think teachers do the best that they can do with what the situation they're in. And I think they need to take the pressure of, oh my gosh, these are supposed to be implemented starting next fall. I do think, though, there's a little bit of silver lining here that I think teachers, not saying we have more time to do anything, but I do think there's more time to use in collaboration than there maybe it was before. So like I'm working with 3 school districts, Sutar and I are working with 3 school districts right now, and just we've been able to meet with them more often because they're not always in front of students. So, and that might not be the case for everybody. So I go back to teachers need to do the very best they can with what they have. And their very best might look different day to day. We have to practice self-compassion and grace right now more than anything. And but I do think, teaching kids to be movers with what they have at home and the space they have at home, I think is really useful. Really useful.
Yeah.
It's just it's a different lens. I think good pedagogy is good pedagogy, whether it's face-to-face or online.
And that solid foundation becomes adaptable in any setting then.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, Stacy, an interesting conversation around standards because we'll talk more about building a culture later in this podcast here, specifically to classes. But I think what Dr. Malley has done is building a different culture around the idea of standards, because the initial idea of standards is not one of excitement and not one of necessarily enthusiasm. I mean, and they just that committee that wrote those standards and how they have not only wrote the standards but also presented the standards. They're really changing that culture around what those standards do for us as Phi Ed teachers. And I think you've come up with a list of some very, very interesting ways and again, very helpful ways of what these standards are doing for us and why they bring excitement when we get the chance to talk to somebody that was on that committee.
Yeah, and well, we've talked to a couple. Carol Martin, we've chatted with, and then Sutar as well. And so, in talking to these people that were deeply entrenched in this process, it's really helped me because I'm with you. I saw them as a burden and something I had to do, and they've kind of given me these 6 words came out to me as she was talking here. The first one she mentioned was progression. And I remember when I first started teaching PE after 17 years of teaching health,
all of a sudden I'm thrown back into this. It's been 17 years since I've been in the college classroom learning about PE standards. It was nice to lean on them and see, oh, what can I expect from a second grader compared to a fifth grader and that type of a thing. I don't know. Did you find them
And that's
that progression nice?
Yeah, and exactly how she highlighted them, how they're written out from the elementary world, from K to 5. You can look at throwing and you can see that progression, or catching, and see that progression, what becomes age appropriate. And again, when we talked to Carol Martin, the genius behind them is they were intentionally vague.
The next one was guidance. And that word just gave me just a sense of relaxation, going, oh, they don't have to be, I don't have to follow everything to a T, and it's not scripted out. And if I step out of line here,
Yep,
I'm
intentionally
in trouble.
vague.
Yeah, it just helped me relax into and go, oh, they're there for me. They're not like working against me, so to speak, where I have to fit into them. They're there just to provide a guidelines, because without them, I mean, who knows what thousands of different types of movements we could be teaching. And we do want it to be, at least have a package that when the public knows you went through this system, they know you were taught these, certain skills along the way. I think that's fair to have the public ask
provide students a foundation. There's that word we've been using all podcasts here. Provide students with a basic foundation of skills so that they can be lifelong movers. Yep. So we've got progression, we've got guidance.
Accountability fits right into that. That's the next word she used. Absolutely. And that I believe we should have accountability. And for the various reasons we just talked about. The next one would be provides a starting point. And that's what it did for me when I first started teaching. And as we talk about this, it's interesting thinking about it, but in some ways, you should really lean on them when you first start teaching. But after 8 or 10 years of teaching, I'm not saying you should standards, because the next word is minimal. These are minimum standards.
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't base your whole class on the minimum that you want students to learn. That once you've got the basics of that down after 2, 3, 4 years of teaching, you should be moving on to more advanced type of thinking and type of activities that are going beyond that. Again, not straying from the standards, but building on them and adding, some more SEL type things and some more critical thinking and some more classroom management or classroom culture type of building stuff in your curriculum.
We've got progression, we've got guidance, we've got accountability, we've got a starting point, we've got a minimal. I've got a feeling like you're going to hit us with a sledgehammer with the last one here. What save the best for last, did you?
Well, yeah, because she did. She tied this into what we were talking about on the previous segment, where our main job is to help students enjoy movement. And these standards should be, what did she say? She said interconnected with fun. And if it should not interfere with our main goal of making sure students enjoy the movement. It should be fully embedded with and having fun. So I don't know. Those are the big things that came to me from hearing her in that segment. Just boom, it just jumped out at me and really not only set my mind at ease about the standards, but really actually get me excited about them.
And a clear difference here. There can be two kinds of fun in Phi Ed class. I mean, just like anything, there's two kinds of fun when you're driving down the road. You can be having a lot of fun going 90 miles an hour, but that's very dangerous. Same thing in our Phi Ed class. There's two different kinds of fun here. There's chaos fun that the kids are having, out of control and dangerous to everybody, including themselves. And then there's deliberate fun that's based off those standards, based off deliberate activities that are well designed, with a learning target in mind, and an activity that kids are going to enjoy that movement, and then take it with them. And I think that's applicable to all areas of education.
That's well said, Jamie. I like that.
I feel like I just had. You ever see that movie Old School, and Will Ferrell blacks out and he gets out the amazing rebuttal statement and snaps back to it. It's kind of one of those.
I like it. So, I didn't see you black out at all. It looked like you actually put some thought into that.
Yeah, it must be bad lighting. But anyways, so in this next segment here, Dr. Malley just kind of takes everything and combines it together, and we start talking about building a culture. And she makes a clear again, clear differentiation between a culture, classroom culture, and classroom management. And that really made me, after over 15 years of teaching, I've always thought classroom management. And then again, she hit us with classroom culture, and you're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So
Yeah.
let's learn about this classroom culture. Let me switch gears for a second, because you really caught my attention in one of our first emails when you talked about classroom culture, because I've always referred to it as classroom management. And it really made me reflect and think about classroom management as a whole and my approach to it. So would you take some time just to expand on that philosophy?
Yeah, I don't really remember when I kind of shifted this thinking, but when you think about managing, thinking about herding and thinking about telling people what to do and they do it. And it's really about compliance. And so if you do what I ask you to do, even if you don't want to do it and you don't like it, but if you comply, then the lesson is good. And so I started finding that my students, when they were out working with kids, like in a field experience, they would say, and I'd ask them, how'd the lesson go? They would say it went great, or that it didn't go well. And I'd always ask them why. And it was never about, well, my students learned or they asked great questions. It was always whether or not they did what I asked them to do. And so they based the quality of their experience, or they would assess their own quality based on whether or not the students listened to them and followed the rules. And so they were so focused on managing them that they forgot that instructional strategies are our best way to manage students. That if we have sound instructional practices, then it's more about creating this culture of where the students look at you and they know you love teaching. It's obvious that you love your job. When every student believes that they are the most important person in your life at that moment in time, that you give them your undivided attention. When you give students voice, even young children, when they get voice in deciding what are the norms, even online, why can't the children have a voice in figuring out what are the norms going to be? What is the first thing we're going to do when we get on a Zoom? What are your jobs going to be? And so it's not about compliance. And I don't think the word management is a bad word. I don't, but I just think this history that it comes with my students, in that if kids aren't listening, then I'm a bad teacher. And I don't think that's true. And so helping young developing teachers understand that it takes time to build relationships. One teacher sees a veteran teacher teaching. They think that's what's going to happen when they teach. And they don't realize all of the upfront work that went into establishing that culture.
Yeah.
Establishing that environment. The consistency of when the kids come in the door, you're there waiting for them. You say hi to them. You look them in the eye. You use their name. You remember little things about them and you ask them about those things. And so all those tiny little things that are so important for teachers, but a young teacher doesn't see those things. They see this veteran teacher who it's flowing. It's flowing and it's just perfect. And they're like, oh, that was simple. And they think they don't have to write a lesson plan, because a veteran teacher doesn't necessarily need to write lesson plans. Your lesson plans are going to look different. But I think sometimes young developing teachers make it harder for themselves because they don't necessarily buy into the detail of thinking and planning that a young teacher has to do. And all that upfront work that went into developing that culture. So, I even think, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm going to throw that curveball back in there and develop that culture. You kind of touched on a little bit, but so what resources or critical thinking do you instill in your college students? How are we going to develop that culture now in a virtual setting? How are we going to build those? How are we going to build those relationships?
Right. And I think humanizing a class, whether it's face-to-face or online, is really similar. The students you have in front of you want to feel valued. And so they feel valued when you use their name, and you use their name often. So they know that you learned their name. They feel valued when you remembered that last night they were going to have spaghetti with grandma and you asked how it went. You know, they know they're valued when you say hi to them in the hallway. They know they're valued when they first walk into the gym and you recognize them. They first get into the Zoom and you recognize them. And you take the time to ask them questions. And so it's just a different format. So I've been starting all my lessons on Zoom with some kind of culturally responsive, humanizing activity. So I'm trying to model what I hope that they will use while I'm at the same time trying to humanize my class. I don't know if that made sense.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. A little
Absolutely.
leadership by example type philosophy.
So I actually have two hats. I literally have two hats that I put on. And I tell them, okay, so right now you're the learner. So you have your learner hat on. And I'm going to teach you as if I want you to learn something from me. But then I also stop and say, okay, time out. What strategies did I just use? So now put your teacher hat on. And could you use the strategies I just used when you're a teacher? So it's, you know, preparing teachers is a double whammy because every single thing I model is an opportunity to teach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just as much as everything I'm intentionally teaching them.
So in your Zoom meeting, you have those two different hats. So people that are listening to this and they didn't see the YouTube version, you literally have a hat that says learner, and then you will pull out the other one during your Zoom. I love this. It sounds like an elementary lesson, but you're teaching college students, but why not? They get the point then. And
we're all kids, you know, and again, I've worked hard to develop a relationship with my students, you know, and that's from day one. And I'll be super honest with you. The class that I'm struggling with the most right now are my kids that I've never met before.
Sure.
And so, you know, I have a fundamentals of movement class. I have about 48 kids in there, which is way, way too many, but it's a good problem to have in our program right now. Mm-hmm. But half of them I've had once and half of them I've never met. And this is a class where I'm asking them to act like 5-year-olds. And so to do that with me, with everybody else is hard enough, but to now do it in their own room on video.
Right.
They're just like looking around and like, who is this woman?
Yeah.
What does she want me to do? But I think when I'm face to face, I'm very uninhibited mover. I really just, what you get is what you get with me. I'm very genuine.
And that's developing a culture.
I fail a lot in front of my students. I say the wrong thing, I do the wrong thing, and I own it. But
and that allows them to do the same.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Fantastic.
But I'm worried about my freshmen right now. My kids, or not my freshmen, my students that I've never met before.
Okay.
Because I have to find ways to get to know them better. And what I'm thinking is doing some really small group Zooms where I just take the time to say, okay, you two students, we're going to meet for 10 minutes and let's just get together and talk.
Yeah.
But I go back to relationships being the foundation of quality teaching. And it's so easy to say, but that is something that has to be built upon. And it's just fascinating to hear where that came from, that actually was developed all the way back to when I was in college. And my instructors were modeling this sort of thing, building relationships with me as a student, and that I would in turn do that for my students.
Yeah, it's an affective skill. You know, it's a skill that
it doesn't come by accident.
No, it doesn't come by accident. It doesn't come naturally to all students. I have a lot of students who are very quiet and they aren't like me, like, you know, like And it's okay. I don't want them to be mini me's. That's absolutely not what I want. I want them to find who they are going to be as a teacher.
Yeah.
And I should say the relationship building, that part of it doesn't come by accident. The quality veteran teachers that your students see, they've spent that background time, years upon just developing that relationship with the 600 kids that they see.
Absolutely.
Hey, Stacy. Again, this was a big part for me because I was kind of the traditional developing classroom management and went through extensive measures and, research and doing everything to really hone in on developing better classroom management.
Mm-hmm.
And then a 5-minute conversation with Dr. Malley about culture sparked my interest, which I mean, just, mind blowing here. So help me out here with this culture versus management.
Yeah, I really liked what she focused on with the students of hers, with that idea of compliance. Because a lot of us think, yeah, it was a good lesson. The kids did what I said. We're all good. And it is good. I don't want to take that away. But that isn't really the point of the lesson, to have the kids obey you. It's like she said, what did they learn and those types of things. And so I liked her differentiation between classroom management, classroom culture. She, by the way, I'm just going to plug this now. I was going to wait till the end, but I'll just plug it now. We've got 2 other podcasts where she and some students come on, coming up here in these other podcasts, where we dived deep into this building a culture. And so keep looking for those if you're interested in this culture idea. But to get to what my point I was going to say is this idea of building culture, building classroom management. Actually, I'm going to turn it back on you. What is the difference? What you said it made a big difference to you. What is the difference in your mind?
I guess I see classroom management as just a piece of the culture that you create. And the classroom culture is just everything surrounding your gym. And that management is just a piece. To me, the culture is the relationships. To me, the culture is the management. The culture is the students working together, the students helping each other. You have empathy built in there. You have acceptance built in there. And that's just the overall culture. And, you ask, so what kind of culture do I want to create in my gym? I want to create one of mutual, where build relationships and students where it's okay to make mistakes, where kids are not afraid to keep trying. They're not afraid to make mistakes, because we as a culture will continue to encourage them, help them, do whatever we can, so that when they finally succeed, then we celebrate with them. And that's all students. And that's kind of the culture that I want to develop in my class, and mutual respect. So there's just so much more that goes into culture instead of just that obedience part of management.
Yeah. And she mentioned that piece about the students don't get, and I love what she said about how much upfront work went into creating that culture. And that's that piece I kind of wanted to hone in on a little bit here. Is it feels like the culture takes forethought. I guess management does too, but culture, to build this culture, you really have to put some time and thought into, and be very, very purposeful into teaching and reteaching respect, and teaching and reteaching the fact that, we're invited to make mistakes. If you never make a mistake, you're not going to grow nearly as fast as if you do. All those types of things you were just mentioning, that's not going to happen by accident. You have to build and do certain parts of your lesson and certain words you choose to use in order to enhance those. Otherwise, they will not be there.
And another piece that I've really struggled with, that you've helped me out with, is I said, I think relationships is a huge part of teaching. And we have 650 kids in the school. So I'm not going to be able to, realistically, you cannot build those in-depth relationships with each individual student. You really helped me put some perspective on how to build relationships with 650 students. So you want to share with us that little insight?
Well, it was more just this idea of the culture. You're not going to be able to, like she said, you're not going to be able to ask every kid how spaghetti dinner went with grandma if you got 670 kids. You just can't. but you can build a culture where those students feel valued. Even if you didn't have a face-to-face conversation with that kid today, they felt you cared for them. I don't know, it kind of reminds me of Mr. Rogers and some of these other TV personalities that never have met some of us kids, but so many of us adults that grew up with Mr. Rogers, if you ask, hey, does Mr. Rogers care about you? Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was an inspiration in my life. Of course, he loved me. You know, I never met him, but I got that feeling that he truly cared. He had that culture about every one of his shows that was developed as part of his culture.
So, in this next section, we're going to talk about this last section here. We're going to talk about being resourceful, and Dr. Malley tries to, that's one of her foundational parts is critical thinking and students being resourceful, gathering and something she created a cadre for her students of FIA teachers around the nation here to really hone in on what it means to be resourceful. So let's take a listen to this last section.
Kristi, there's another thing you're doing that I think is just absolutely genius, and it's it's the cadre you've developed, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because I just think that is, if you don't know what skills your students are going to need, the teachers that are in the field right now are going to be the first ones to find out, because we don't know either for sure what skills they're going to need. But this cadre you've put together puts them in touch. And I just think I'd like you to just talk a little bit about that, how you came up with that.
Last year, so I teach our elementary methods class every fall. And when I first came to Winona, there was no field experience with it. So our students didn't really even see real kids until they student taught, which is, I think, unethical. Yeah. And so we slowly in our program have started to give them more experiences each year with real kids. And so last year, I wanted to expand our reach beyond just the Winona area. So most of our, a field experience, it has to be close by because they need to be able to get there and then get back to campus. And so I reached out to teachers that I knew. So last year it was pretty small. It was teachers that I knew from Wisconsin that I had relationships with. It was a few that I knew in Minnesota. I didn't know very many yet. A couple of my alumni from UWL that were in Colorado. So I reached out, and basically the purpose of it was I wanted to open up my students' eyes to what really can happen. Because I think, I'm like their mom. And when a mom tells kids something, it's like, it's not right. But if somebody else tells them it, then it's right all of a sudden. And so I wanted them to see what I was trying to teach them. So it wasn't just coming from me. It was coming from other people. And I was so pleasantly pleased with the first year that I did it. The teachers, they sent videos. A teacher from Wisconsin, she took us on a tour around her gym and how she structures her gym in a way to create a social, emotional, efficient, effective, safe culture. I had teachers who would sit in their locker room and just videotape and talk to us. I had one teacher in Minnesota who actually videotaped a whole lesson where he was teaching kids the protocol of how to find a partner. And so what I would do is I'd ask them prompts about 2 or 3 weeks before I wanted to use them. I'd organize those prompts, and then those really became the instructional materials I used in my lessons. And so my kids I would maybe introduce a concept, maybe talk a little bit about the theory and research behind the concept, give my ideas, and then they would get a chance to analyze these other ideas. So I might show a video from a teacher, and then they get into small groups, and I'd have a series of questions they would talk about. It was definitely a success. My students really felt it was useful. So they not only had their field experience teacher in the area, but now they had this group of, I think I had about 22 teachers last year. Well, this year, I wanted to do the same thing. I knew it was going to be super important. I knew that I needed a more diverse group. I didn't just want teachers from the Midwest. I really wanted to reach teachers from small, rural, really rural communities. I wanted teachers who teach in have 100 kids at a time, who teach in big suburban areas, you know, inner city. I wanted a lot of diversity. So I threw it out on Twitter, and holy cow, it was like overwhelming. Every day I just kept getting, I'll do it. Hey, that sounds fun.
Don't we have a wonderful professional PE community? It's just spectacular.
It's crazy to me. It's crazy. And then I'm like, okay, are you sure? So this year you really want to do this? And so I have about 56 teachers from California to New York to Hawaii to Minnesota. Yeah.
That's so powerful for your students.
Oh,
to
it's
have
powerful for me.
Well,
It's powerful for me because, and so the first task that I asked all these teachers to do was to do a Flipgrid video, as you both know, to record a Flipgrid video and just introduce yourself to my students. And my students then were to listen for things that resonated with them. And we had a conversation about that. And I mean, it's been awesome already for my students to hear things that sound like what Dr. Malley says, but also contradict what Dr. Malley says.
hey.
And so, you know, and that's okay. And so my first big thing that I want to use this group of teachers for is the next module. And that's all about creating a culture. And so, as you know, the prompts that I asked were really about sharing the instruction materials, the how-to. That's the piece that is so hard, is I want you to, okay, great. I get that. That's a great visual, but how do you use it? Literally, what do you do to help students use that? And how does that add to your culture? I love when teachers tell me their philosophy and their why. That's super important for my kids to hear, my students, sorry, to hear. But I want the practical. So if you want to teach them how to get a partner in a kind, safe way, how do you do it, but how do you teach that? So what are the instructional strategies you use to teach that to your students?
That's been a miserable question. It's been hanging on me for a week or however long you sent that. It keeps coming back, and I go over and over. It's so fabulous to be forced to really think of what can I present to these college kids, students, and that does get beyond here's what I do. There's so many things I do without thinking about it. And why do I do that? Why do I set my gym up the way I set it up? And I know I've thought through it all, but you've made me just really think through. So it's been really fun to be forced to really, I think in many ways, every teacher should go through that after they've been teaching for 15 years or more, be forced to rethink how we do, how and why and what exactly we do to make our class go like it does. It's fabulous, I think.
It's also done to model. I love to learn. I read. I love to listen to podcasts. I've listened to yours quite a few times.
Well, thank you.
I loved all the free state conferences this summer was just fabulous. So to go to a California state conference and not pay anything is like fabulous. And it was amazing. And so I think it's important for my students to know that it's being a teacher is a lifelong learning process. And you have to have an open mind. And
a great way to show the students how to be resourceful, going back to our first discussion of being critical thinkers and being resourceful. And how are we going to master this distance learning thing? We're going to be resourceful. And this is just another way to get the information that you need.
Yep.
So let's shift gears for a second here and just think back from the beginning of your career to now. We talk about the state of physical education. It's kind of where are we at now? What's the state of FIED? What's the biggest change you've seen from the first year of your career to now as a associate professor at Winona State University?
Yeah, I think it's that shift from planning and teaching around a piece of equipment and around an activity. I remember as an undergrad, put together a lesson about the parachute, put together a lesson that uses beanbags. And so that shift from a focus on the teacher and the teaching process to a focus on the student and the learning process. And I think that's a shift that it happened a long time ago, conceptually, theoretically, but I think all of us as teachers are somewhere, trying to make sense of it. And so just really that whole idea of preparing future teachers who really don't even know that old way of doing it, that the only way they know is to first start with, what do I want my students to learn and how am I going to know they learned it? Not starting with the piece of equipment or the activity. To me, that's probably been the biggest shift. And and again, not all teachers have made that shift yet, but I think we're all somewhere in the process of trying to wrap our head around, how do I start with what I want students to learn? I think that's probably one of the biggest things that has changed in the educational world, but that's not just in PE.
Right.
I think that's in every content area.
Agreed.
It's like, as a science teacher, I'm going to do this lab today. Well, no. What do you want kids to learn today? And the lab is a tool to help them learn that.
Yes. Yes.
So,
And
I guess
I was gonna say, and a little shift that I've noticed in my short duration of a career has just been, going back to being resourceful, how we get our information.
yeah.
And, when I first started my career, you were incredibly lucky. In fact, that was for the veteran teachers, the ones higher on the seniority list that got to go to the conferences, and then maybe you get to hear what they saw. But I say now we go to Twitter and we have professional development on demand. We can be part of cadres or whatever it might be, but it's just then that instant, it's actually almost overwhelming. Where if you say I need an activity to reinforce throwing, you type that into Twitter and you'll get 10 million 10 million different videos. Probably,
I agree. Overwhelming is a good word. I think you do get overloaded, and you have to learn how to shut down sometimes. And
that's where it's important that you're doing that critical thinking, because you might see a cool video on there, but does it really nail what you're trying to get across? And I think another caveat of this is the technology. There's so many, kids in this generation that you're teaching is very comfortable with all these new apps and those types of things. And there's so much good that technology can bring to PE, but I've had to wrestle with a lot of that because I love technology, but I've ended up in the past 5 years, I've ended up tossing several of things out. And because I just found when I reassessed it, I was like, actually, I'm not accomplishing the goal I want to anymore. I'm using the great technology. The kids are having fun with it, but I missed my target with that.
Right.
So I had to pull back. And
if you're gonna toss out your iPhone 10, though, let me know and I'll take it.
Yeah, I still have it. The iPhone 4.
Steve, I think you said something really interesting there. I think we assume that college kids today are digital natives.
I do.
And I don't think they are. I think they, they are on their phones all the time and they use social media all the time, but I don't know about their comfort level with using technology as a tool for teaching.
Interesting.
So even a lot of my students will, one of the questions I ask is, how comfortable are you with online learning? What is your experiences with online learning? How can I support you with online learning? And I would say many of them will say, well, I'm not super comfortable with this whole technology thing. So I think they live on their phone. I think a lot of us live on our phone,
Mm-hmm.
and they're comfortable communicating through that way, but actually using technology for a pedagogical tool, I think you're probably further along than you think you are compared to them. I think they're so worried about doing it wrong that they, this whole growth mindset, fixed mindset, I think a lot of students are so afraid of not knowing and doing it wrong that then they won't try. And, I'm not a digital native, but I'm also not afraid to push buttons. I'm not afraid to try it because I'm not going to break it.
Yeah.
And let's just try it.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out.
I'm so glad you called me out on that, because the more I think about that, I think of my own kids, and man, they're comfortable with what they do. But if I brought up things that I do to innovate in the classroom, and I ask them, hey, think I could use this? And they look at me like, I don't know. I never touched that before. And that's very true. Boy, you just opened my mind to something there, Kristi.
Never thought of it that way.
Yeah, that's genius. I like it.
So, well, Kristi, I can't thank you enough. It's been truly an honor, but is there anything else you'd like to share or share with us before we end?
Yeah, I will. And this is something I get really, like, I cry in front of my students a lot. They're like, oh my gosh, here she cries again. But it's just because I really do. This is a lifestyle to me. It's not a job. But I think now more than ever, the well-being of our kids has to be at the forefront. And I don't think there's a time that I've ever experienced where physical education is more important. Physical education and health education are more important than they are right now. Teachers have to be willing to advocate more than they've ever had to advocate. And because parents don't know, administrators don't know. And I don't think it's so much that they don't value us. I just don't think they know. And they have so much going on in their worlds. They can't keep up in what's going on in the world of wellness. And so teachers need to be at the forefront and be saying, hey, social emotional learning, hey, we can do that. I could be on that committee. Physical education could do that. Or PBIS. So, we're talking about a PBIS program in our school. Hey, we have a whole standard on personal responsibility and safety and respect. That's us. And so teachers need to be willing and confident enough in themselves to advocate for the power of physical education to change the quality of a school experience. And, if we're not at the table right now, we're going to be on the table. And I just think it's a great opportunity right now. And so I will just put a little dig in for what Sutar and I are doing right now. Sutar teaches at Mankato. She's definitely known for across the nation, internationally, for adapted physical education, but very, very dear friend. And we really believe that professional development for teachers should be designed by teachers. It shouldn't be designed by somebody else telling them what they need to learn and then them sitting in a professional development setting having to do something that's not relevant. And so one of our passions is to provide opportunities for teachers to develop their professional development and for us to facilitate that professional development along the way. And so we really wanted to become these consultants who could go around and just really help teachers understand the standards, but it's developed more than that. It's not about us coming around and telling teachers what they need to do, but it's us really listening to what teachers want and then designing the professional learning around what they want. And it's been such a wonderful journey, and we're starting super slow, but we're slowly getting into some schools and working with some amazing teachers right now. So
what does that look like if people wanted to know more about that? Do you have a website that you've started? Do you have how would they connect with you if they wanted to get in touch and find out more?
The best thing would be to email either of us or to follow us on Twitter and message us and then we could talk about it. And we can design it in many different ways. It could be a long-term project. It could be, right now we're working with Columbia Heights and we're doing 4 professional development sessions throughout the whole year. But I think we're able to morph whatever we do to the needs of the teachers. And it's not about telling teachers they're doing stuff wrong, because teachers aren't doing stuff wrong. They're doing stuff great. It's just, I think PE teachers need opportunities to stay current. They need time to be with one another to stay current.
Yep. And your Twitter handle is?
Grateful Learners. So capital GR, number 8, capital FUL, capital LEARNE. So you'll have to put that somewhere. look it up and put it somewhere, but it's Grateful Learner.
Good. And
Awesome.
best email to get you to you?
Would be my kmalley@winona.edu, or I have a Google, kmalley619@gmail.com.
Okay. And we'll put those in the show notes, but sometimes people don't get to those and they can maybe look that up.
So, well,
Oh,
Kristi, on behalf of Thinking PE here, we really want to thank you. It's just been an absolute honor and a pleasure to meet you and chat with you. You came highly recommended around the PE community.
thank you.
Thank you. I'm just a person who's learning and figuring it out with everybody. So it was also very wonderful to meet both of you. So thank you for this opportunity.
Jamie, she mentioned that flip grid that the cadre had to send in. Did you send one in?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, I was kind of curious. She said she used that as an illustration in her class and asked them what they related to. What do you think? What do you think they responded in that class?
That might be a question for her later of what resonated throughout all those flip grids from her teachers around the nation as they introduced themselves and talked about their philosophies. And, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking, I'm sure there's a lot of teachers talking about how it's just a passion for kids and, their foundation of teaching, building relationships, skill development, wanting students to be lifelong learners. I think those are probably some of the very basic things that really resonated throughout the teaching community as a whole.
Yeah, I bet you're right. What do you think? Do you think that if a teacher did that 50 years ago, do you think they would be the same? Do you think teachers would be the same? Do you think it ever changes over time?
I wonder. That would actually be a fascinating thing to do. I wonder if relationships have been a foundation of teaching. I wonder if critical thinking is a foundation of teaching. That'd be a fascinating experiment. Get that time machine warmed up and away we go. But even Dr. Malley, she talked about what's changed most for her over her career, and it was a shift in philosophy from I have a piece of equipment, I'm going to teach this, to I want to teach the standard. What equipment do I have at my disposal?
Yeah, that was an interesting statement she made about the technology. She kind of corrected me there when I was just made this assumption that these kids are digital natives, therefore it's all comfortable with them. And she kind of poo-pooed that idea a little bit, saying, yeah, they're great with their phones, chatting with their friends, but try to get them to actually innovate and use it to teach, they're not nearly as comfortable as what we assumed.
And that's a key difference there is a huge difference between using technology and integrating technology into your teaching. And that is a huge difference. And I'm glad she pointed that out, because that's a big deal.
Yeah. Well, that's almost the exact name of my master's program I went through, is integrating technology. And that's what we kind of learned back then, how to do those things and how the difference between integrating. But what we were learning back then is these digital natives got it. That's kind of what we were being taught in my master's class. And it really isn't all that true. And I think about with my own kids, they do great with their things, but they're baffled by what I do with technology. They can't always help me.
Not everybody has their master's from MIT.
Yeah, right. Did I not mention it wasn't MIT?
So and going back to what you had talked about what she's really modeling, but what she's teaching these young professionals to be is critical thinkers and being resourceful. And I just thought this cadre was just a great example of modeling being resourceful, that as quickly as things have changed in this last year, how dramatically things have changed, that she took it upon herself and took that new approach that, I'm not in the field here. How do I get this information? And she pulled together a cadre of teachers of, all around the nation.
Yeah, I really, really respect her for doing that.
And I got to tell you that it's that real-time information, that real-time knowledge that she's gathering in from people that are doing it. And
yeah,
I think that's super. And then take that critical thinking approach to it. You've got some pretty impactful learning going on. And I got to tell you, the lesson learned here is a solid foundation of basic teaching skills. It's going to help us be comfortable in a super uncomfortable environment.
And that, Jamie, is Thinking PE.
Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter at Thinking PE. Find us on all your favorite podcast providers by searching Thinking PE. For more resources and videos, go to www.thinkingpe.com. Thanks for listening.